Hey, welcome back to Robot Cantina. Put yourself in the upright position. I'm going to need you to focus. Not even trying. Better yet, just grab a box of Captain Crunch and watch the video. Then go get a haircut. You definitely need it. Before we get started, I'd like to thank everybody who commented on the previous video that went into detail on the mini alternator that we're using on the cement mixer powered street legal go-kart. I really try and read all the comments and answer as many as I can, at least for a few days after the video has been released, but after that it's hard to keep up. An interesting comment that seems to be popular was based on the fact that since the mini alternator used permanent magnets instead of a field coil, it was not an alternator, but perhaps a generator or a dynamo. I'm not really sure about that train of thought. Anyway, let's look at some evidence that may confirm that the mini alternator is in fact an alternator and not a generator or dynamo. Well, the first clue is how it's advertised on the Jungle site. According to the propaganda, it's being sold as an alternator, but keep in mind, it wouldn't be the first time the propaganda was wrong, especially on the Jungle site. I reckon the next best thing to do is have a look at what sort of electricity the alternator produces. So for a quick refresher, an alternator produces alternating current and a generator produces DC or direct current. Now, regular people mix the terms up all the time, generator, alternator, whatever, and it's no big deal. The only time it really makes a difference is if you have an electrical background and you inherently use the words correctly. Kinda like how some folks say motor or engine. To an engineer, it means two different things, but in casual conversation, it's acceptable to mix them. So over here we have an oscilloscope connected directly to the blue wires coming out of the alternator. On the scope, I have my ground reference set to the middle of the screen, and if I flip the switch over to AC, well, we get an AC signal that goes above and below the ground reference. Now it ain't a perfect sine wave, but I assure you it's AC. If I flip the switch to DC, well, it's the same signal. So the mini alternator is indeed an alternator and not a generator. So what's the deal with the permanent magnets in the mini alternator? Well, normally an alternator produces a magnetic field with the field windings, and on this simple alternator, the magnetic field is produced with actual magnets. In case you're wondering, the voltage regulator in a proper alternator can vary the strength of the magnetic field, allowing the alternator to produce a strong charge at lower speeds. Now with the permanent magnets in our mini alternator, the magnetic field strength is fixed, and the alternator can't quite produce a lot of current at low speeds. That's both good and bad, but for our application, it's perfect. Now another comment that keeps popping up is why don't we use solar cells to charge the battery? Well, I guess we could, but the car spends about 99% of its life in a dark garage, and any solar cells attached to the roof would increase the aerodynamic drag. Plus they're expensive, so that's pretty much a no-go. Since we're here, it seems some folks don't believe the cheater switch we use actually makes a difference. Again, I don't follow that logic. It may be that some folks don't understand the principles of power generation. So with the alternator disconnected from the battery, I'll spin the little pulley. And as you can see, it spins fairly easy, but it does have some drag from the permanent magnets. But overall, that's the nature of the beast. Now if I short the two wires together and try spinning the alternator, well, that's a different story. All of a sudden it doesn't spin so easy. Now the fact that the wires are shorted together technically represents a full load on the alternator, and it's for demonstration purposes. So when we flip the cheater switch during the acceleration runs, we're exploiting a quirk in how the voltage regulator works and effectively disconnects the alternator from the battery. And at that point the alternator is free to spin without putting a load on the engine. Let's take a look. So right now the engine's idling, and at this point the alternator is only capable of providing about 4 amps to charge the battery, and that's fine. If I turn on the headlights and run the wipers, the alternator still only puts out 4 amps. You see, we count on the fact that the alternator doesn't work well at idle. Now if I rev the engine up, the alternator starts making power. And as I recall, it's putting out something like 17 amps with the lights and wipers going. And that's perfect. Now when I switch the alternator off, the lights dim slightly. And if you listen closely, the engine sounds different. So it looks like the cheater switch does make a difference. Now I could spend an entire video explaining and measuring stuff, but at this point it's clear that the system works exactly the way we want it to. As far as parts go, this system was really cheap, but it did require a bit of fabrication. Alright, well, enough with the alternators. I believe today's topic is making the car go faster. More specifically, we want to see if modifying the belt drive can help with acceleration. So boom, here's another diagram. Actually, it's a snapshot of data we recorded during an acceleration run. This is the baseline before we do any modifications to the drive system. So what we're looking at are two signals. The yellow trace is the throttle position sensor, and when the TPS gets to 100%, that's the signal the acceleration test has started. The white trace is engine RPM, and as you can see, it rises sharply as soon as the TPS hits 100%. Now, we have a slight hiccup here, and that's an engine tune issue. We'll disregard that for now. So the RPM rises, and here we can see a little bit of clutch or belt slip before the torque converter gets good traction on the belt. Then we sort of flatline here at 2800 RPM for about 3 seconds as the car starts moving. Next is a rapid climb in RPM. Now, I've seen hundreds of these data log files, and I've always assumed this was the CVT going through its range, but it might be from belt slipping. I don't know. Anyhow, right here is where I assume the CVT has gone through its range, and it's fully locked up. Well, regardless, at this point, the belt drive seems to be locked up, and now we see a dip in RPM. This dip or valley is what we're trying to get rid of, if it's even possible. So that's a quick overview. Let's take a look at the actual 0 to 50 mile per hour run. For point of reference, when we hit 50, that's when we shift the transmission. So that was the baseline that we're starting with. It took 33.23 seconds to get to 50 miles per hour. Scary slow, no doubt, but at least it gets to 50. Oh yeah, so we started off in third gear, and that's the best gear for this combination of random parts and a dilapidated Honda Insight. Trust me, if we could go any faster, any other way, we would have done it by now. Third gear allows the car to accelerate from 0 to 50 without shifting until 50 miles per hour. Now, if we started off in second gear, we would have had to shift the transmission at 30 miles per hour, and shifting the transmission takes time without a proper clutch. Sometimes second gear is a fraction faster, and sometimes second gear is a fraction slower. By using third gear, we're consistent and the shifting variable is eliminated. So previously we scored 33.70 seconds, so this time around we're slightly faster. What we want to try today is modify the driven pulley and see if that will change the slope of the engine RPM. The prevailing thought is a modified pulley will decrease the angle of the slope and the engine may have an easier time accelerating the street legal go-kart. What I really want to get rid of is a slump in RPM. A nice even slope to 50 miles per hour would be awesome. So in a previous video, I started rambling about modifying the torque converter clutch to help with off-the-line performance, and of course plenty of folks in the comment section said that was the wrong thing to do. They pointed out that it's actually not the clutch that needs to be modified, it's the driven pulley that needs to be modified. Sure enough, that's absolutely correct, and that's why I love reading the comment section. So the idea is to increase the spring tension preload on the driven pulley, and this in effect will cause the torque converter to go through its range slower and perhaps keep the engine in its power band longer, or something like that. I'm sure someone will explain it in the comment section. So let's take a quick look at how the torque converter or CVT system works. You see, as the engine revs up, the ratio changes. Of course, right now there's no load on the system and it goes through its range pretty quick. Let's see what happens when we make some changes. Well, I reckon the first thing we need to do is remove this driven pulley. Let's just do a fade to black and the pulley will magically be off the car. Getting the pulley off is both easy and a nightmare. You see, it doesn't actually come off the cradle due to a clearance issue, but it will come off with sufficient forces applied, and that's what we did off camera. So this is a generic 7.5-inch driven pulley. Now here's where the preload spring is anchored on this pulley, and there's no additional holes to allow adjusting the preload. Yeah, I'm aware of these holes, but they're drilled too close to the inner hub and are unusable. Or in other words, the preload spring cannot be inserted into these holes no matter how hard you try. It just won't fit. Remember, this is a generic pulley and not a genuine Comet pulley. I'm not really sure what these holes are for, but the spring won't go into them. So it looks like we'll need to drill new holes in this pulley. I figure we'll put 2 holes in it and see what happens. Of course, now we'll have to take the pulley apart to modify it on the drill press. I think now is a great opportunity to fade to black again and the pulley will magically be apart. So this is the original hole, and we're going to add 2 additional holes in the pulley. The idea is to anchor the spring in one of the new holes and take the car out for a test, and then try the other hole if necessary. Alright, on to the drill press. So fast forward a little bit and the pulley's back together. Now, we drilled 2 holes because we wanted to try this modification in 2 steps, but when reassembling the pulley, we ended up using the second hole. Well, we discovered the spring doesn't really want to be moved, and I'll be surprised if the spring stays in place. It's very sketchy. Now, this could be a fluke and I have a defective pulley or spring, but the spring is wound tight enough that it's bending at the anchor point and doesn't look like it could stretch anymore. So instead of the 2 steps that we were going to do this in, we're going to do it in 1 step, and we're going for the maximum preload that appears to be possible. So in other words, we're skipping the first step and going directly to the second step. So let's do some road tests. Well, this is a surprise. The 0 to 50 time was worse. We did the 0 to 50 time in 39.67 seconds, while previously doing it in 33.23 seconds. So that's a 6.44 second difference. Not in our favor. So I have to tell you, I struggle for answers. We tried this a dozen or so times, and the results were the same. We even waited for the weather conditions to be exactly the same and no dice. Now here are the data plots for before and after, and they more or less look the same, but there are some subtle differences that are hard to see in this format. Now, if we forensically analyze the data and focus for a moment on this hill, the data is showing that after the modification, it took slightly longer for the engine to climb to the peak, and that's sort of what we wanted. Actually, we were expecting to see more of a radical difference, but that's not the case. So what happened? Well, 2 things. First, the engine could be down on power, and that would explain a lot. Except, after the first few runs, we went back and tried tuning the engine, and obviously that made no difference. So the second thing that may have happened is, well, since we had the driven pulley apart, we lubricated the friction points before installing it back in the car. So we successfully increased the preload, but at the same time we lubricated the friction points and introduced an unknown variable into the equation. I don't know. What I do know is the majority of the difference happens after this dip in RPM. So from this point to the end of the test is where we gain time. Now that's unfortunate because this little detail pretty much eliminates the whole CVT from the equation. And the reason is the CVT is locked up by the time it hits this valley. So either the engine is dying or the changes we made was the wrong thing to do. So now we have no choice. It's time for the stupid charger. But first, and now for something completely different. Fragile. Must be Italian. Meh. In case you haven't figured it out by now, this is the 670
Bigger block.
So the stupid charger is plan A to get us to 70 miles per hour. This is plan B. Let's take a better look and see what we're getting into. So it has some loose hoses. We'll have to figure that out. Oh, and over here is where the gasoline, or petro for the metric crowd, goes into. Looks like this monster has an oil cooler. Not too bad, I'll take it. There we go, an oil filter of some kind. I reckon this'll come in handy. Okay, well this muffler ain't gonna work. Just like the engine, it's huge. Now it looks like this motor has a voltage regulator for an alternator, a generator, or whatever. The specs say it puts out about 2 amps, so that'll be a downgrade from our mini alternator, and we might have to do some magic on this one. The throttle's nice, but it's gonna get binned right off the bat. The ignition switch doesn't seem to work. I don't know why it won't start. Well, maybe it's low on oil? Okay, so this is why we don't have nice things. Brand new motor and we're already taking it apart. Well, it's pretty big, and let's see what's under all this stuff. Oh, the cake is a lie? That's weird. Anyway, I reckon this is the air filter. Let's see what's inside of it. So as we filmed this, the camera guy kept telling me not to move. And I'm like, no, you need to move the camera and follow me. I think I'm gonna fire this guy. So it looks like it has a 2-barrel carburetor, and that's good, because we ain't doing fuel injection on this one. Let's see what's under the fan shroud. Now that seems like it shouldn't be loose like that, but whatever, it'll work. Oh cool, the fuel pump. Now we'll probably have to move this or just get rid of it, and probably get a bigger fuel tank too. So off camera, I did some more disassembly, and it looks like this is as small as the engine will get. Of course, we'll have to put the fan shroud back on, but no matter what, this engine is huge. So if we compare it to the spare 420 big block, there's a significant difference in size, but it looks like the crankshaft height is about the same. So yeah, it's going to be a tight fit in the street legal go-kart. I guess I never really mentioned this, but the 420 was a tight fit, and we had to do a lot of stuff to make it fit under the hood. This is going to be difficult level 11 with a category 12 bonus difficulty, whatever that means. Let's see how this fits under the hood. Well, the good news is the 420 has to come out anyway for the stupid charger upgrade. So now's the perfect time to get a feel for how much this motor doesn't fit. This will just take a few seconds. Stand by. Well, it's in, but it's only resting on the cradle. Let's see how it looks with the hood on, and for the metric crowd, that's the bonnet. Slight fit issue. Meh, seems like something's in the way. Let's take a closer look. Oh, the engine's in the way. Well, it's big, and we have a job ahead of us to make it fit. And to make it fit, the hood needs to be able to close. Now, if there's any way that it can be done, we can do it for sure. Now, let's talk about some engineering problems, and we've got some. First of all, this chipper shredder motor is just like any other small industrial engine. It was never meant to be used in an application where it was exposed to thrust loads. So what are thrust loads? Well, the best way to attach the 670 V-twin is directly to the gearbox and use a traditional clutch. As a matter of fact, I do get a lot of comments on why I don't directly connect the engine to the transmission, whether it was the little 212cc or the bigger 420cc engine. And there's two reasons. First, we need the CVT to seamlessly multiply the torque to accelerate the street-legal go-kart. The second reason is because of the thrust loads the engines would be subjected to. So these little engines were made to provide power for various domestic and industrial applications. The output shaft is intended to drive radial loads and not thrust loads. A radial load would be something like a pulley and a belt, and the load would be applied at a 90-degree angle to the crankshaft. The bearings and the engine block have no problem handling this type of load. These engines were never made to handle thrust loads. You see, if we directly connect the engine to the transmission, that would be fine, except that's not possible because we need a way to disengage the engine from the transmission, and that's what the clutch does. So if we hang a flywheel, a clutch, and a pressure plate off the crankshaft, we're still okay. The problem is, when you depress the clutch pedal to disengage the clutch, now you're putting 200 to 300 pounds of thrust load through the crankshaft, and it's being absorbed by a single bearing on the opposite side of the engine block. On these small engines, the block is not reinforced well enough to transfer the thrust load, and the engine blocks will flex a little bit. Now, if it flexes enough times, it'll cause serious damage. Well, why not do it anyway, some would ask. You know, I considered that, and even if I wanted to, I couldn't. Way back in Season 1, Episode 28, we did some minor damage to the transmission. I guess it was major damage, but whatever. Anyway, the transmission still works fine, but it's damaged enough that we can never use an automotive-type clutch again. And, well, that sucks. Not because of the 670 V-twin, but because we wanted to use a regular clutch with the mini diesel engine. Now I have to double check, but I believe this engine has thrust bearings in it, and it can handle thrust loads, but the jury's still out on that one. So in the meantime, we're actively searching for another project car. Another Insight, perhaps? I mean, they are the perfect car for these type of experiments. But they are a bit small under the hood, and since they're made out of 100% of aluminum and plastic, I'm unable to weld on them for major modifications. I don't know, one of these might be fun to play with. We'll see. Anyway, I have 7 days to write, direct, film, and edit the Supercharger video. Plus, on top of that, I actually have to do all the mechanical and fabrication work. So, if you wouldn't mind, please take a moment and click on subscribe. I guarantee it's a lot easier to watch these videos than to make them. Until next time.
That was easy.